Hello and welcome back to the Flywheel Effect. This is Jordan Live School. Today I am joined by my colleague Hannah. She's back again. And our guest today is Miss Cathy Emerson. She's a school psychologist from the Memphis area. Cathy's going to join us today to talk about MTSS. A lot of times we talk about school discipline, school culture. Tier 1 sports is something that comes up a lot. We don't have a lot of chance to talk about Tier 2 and 3. That's why we brought Cathy on today.
No time, no tools, big expectations. How do you transform school culture without derailing the train? Answer: little wins that bring big changes. The Flywheel Effect. Harnessing the power of momentum to create a school culture that celebrates change and drives itself.
Our audience, a lot of times, it's a lot of administrators, district personnel, a lot of it's teachers. The term MTSS might not be universal in all schools. It was in the schools I worked in, but I found that from talking to different folks, it's not always. Can you give us a good definition for the audience?
Yeah, sure. So MTSS, because, schools, we love the alphabet soup and have acronyms for everything. So MTSS stands for multi-tiered systems of support. And depending on your state, depending on, your local education agency, no matter where you are, I promise you that in working in schools, you've worked within this framework or this tiered support system. Some states call it PBIS. Some states call it response to instruction and intervention, or RTI. But MTSS is really just like an umbrella term for those structures. So it's a framework for how you support students from the 3-tier model, tier 1 meaning all, to tier 3 meaning those who need the most intensive supports. I would say MTSS has really some core features or core components that really define it for me, which is one, meaning that we're screening and identifying kids that may need more support. We're providing core instruction, whether that's academic, behavior, or social emotional skills. And then we're using that to identify students early on so that we can intervene and provide more intensive supports.
So I'm glad you used that definition, because a lot of times we think about these structures as just behavior. But this is academic. This is social emotional learning. This covers a lot of things, all the things that kids need extra help in to be successful in school.
Right. Yes, all things. I would say, I can get nerdy about it as a school psychologist, so I could get into historical aspects and what the research says and all that. But I think it's really important to just know that it's not necessarily a new concept in education, but I would say in the late 2000s, the term MTS really took off. In the sense that we need to look at it as a whole child model. So that's why I say academic, behavior, social emotional, because MTSS is really shifting us from looking at PBIS is just for behavior, RTI is just for academics, and moving us into more of an integrated whole child approach.
By the way, if you want to nerd out about it, we are pro nerding out on this podcast. So go for it.
Okay. Well, I think for me, I always like to think of this concept of a multi-tiered system really came from the medical model, the health model. So when we think about, how we approach our physical health, they also use a multi-tiered model, meaning if we take care of our bodies, right, tier 1, if we eat well, exercise, have regular checkups, do preventative, proactive health benefits, then we're less likely to have more intensive needs as we get older, right? But in the medical model, you still have to provide intensive support for people that are struggling with certain aspects of their health, right? Maybe you broke a arm. Well, now you need more additional support, right? Or maybe you now have developed diabetes because tier 1, your preventative health maybe wasn't, or maybe it was genetic. I mean, it could be both, and you need more intensive support. So the concept around that really is modeling that medical health model. And then it got shifted into education as a way to also say, hey, we need to be proactive about how we're teaching students both academics as well as those behavior skills. And that schools need a framework for being able to do that because, as we all know that have worked in education, we tend to have resources, really tight resources, right? And so we can't exhaust all our energy into intensive needs for every single kid. The best bang for our buck in education is putting as much energy and time and resources on that tier one proactive preventative area so that we don't have to spend as much time in tier two and tier three intensive supports.
That was a fantastic explanation. And this is coming from somebody who's on an MTSS team. I wish I got that explanation when I was asked to be on it because I would have known what I was getting into a lot more. I would have understood the concept at the time. Over time, I understood what we were doing, but I wish that would have been explained to me very early. Speaking of that, so I think of this as a team. And you've worked with a lot of different kinds of schools in different locations. Is that kind of the setup? Is it a team? Who's on the team? Is it somebody? How's it work in other places?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a team. It has to be a team approach, and oftentimes, I think that's where it loses its power in its framework is when you try to do it in isolation. And so, again, we talk about I've worked with schools for a really long time, and working in an urban school district that typically are under resourced, right? And so, one of the things that understanding that team concept means that you are able to build a foundation for which to delegate, operate, and have those different components to where everybody is working together to lift that whole thing. Instead of maybe if you've been an assistant principal, or if you've been, I think you said you've been a dean of students. For some reason, we love in schools, leadership loves to just like say, that's yours, right? And now you're doing that in isolation from everything else. Well, it's a tiered system of support. It's a framework for the entire school, right? So if it's done in isolation, it's never going to have the strength and impact that you want it to. So one person can facilitate all that. One person can manage all of that, but it requires a team to fully live that out. Everybody, one band, one sound is what I always like to say. Like, we all know our role and part in this, and we know what pieces we're doing together in order to have one sound when it comes to how we support students.
Do you think that isolation piece, so because you have worked with so many different schools and types of schools, do you think that isolation piece is one of the biggest areas that schools struggle with when it comes to MTSS, or are there other areas that you see the struggle happening most often, I guess?
The thing is that working in schools, you work with passionate people that all that are here to support students, right? And then, I think living in the times of educational reform, and I think also what comes down from federal and state puts a lot of pressure on school districts, on states, on school districts, thus trickling down to, your local district or even individual schools. And so to say that there's a lot of moving parts on why that isolation happens, because there's a lot of accountability markers that are pushed on schools, right? There's a lot of priorities that are beyond an individual school's control, right? Like, we don't get to choose that priority. So what happens is to be able to carry all that, that leaders look at it and go, I need you to just do this, make that, show the accountability for this piece that we're doing it. And somewhere in there, the purpose behind it gets lost. And so that's in isolation. I think that's where I hate to say that it's like everybody's like, you do that, you do that, you do that. And that's just how it is. It's usually like other factors that are impacting why those decisions get made. The end result is it does become operating in silos a lot of time. And I often am trying to shift to how do you get everyone on board without it being overwhelming for just one person. And then also knowing that when everybody's on board, you're going to have a larger impact.
I think that also creates sustainability when you have just more than one person.
that brings me to kind of my second level of this question about MTSS, because we're talking about tier 2 and 3 structures, and it's tier 1 is part of this, but a lot of times that's a separate team, and those are school wide things. Those are things that everyone knows about and everyone's involved in. But some of the best interventions for tier 2 and tier 3 also include a ton of folks. So like something that I was familiar with was check in, check out. I had a lot of like mentors throughout the building that we could pull on for that. Can you give us some examples of kind of your go-to interventions that have been successful with schools in the past? And academic behavior, any you'd like to choose?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about like the multi-tiered system, we're looking at data to determine need, right? And each kid is different. And so really the best, and I say this in a blanket way, but the best tier 2 and tier 3 supports are ones that are using data to accurately identify what type of intervention that particular student needs. Of course, there are just go-to interventions that are going to be good for most students. And check in, check out, you just named that, is one of the most effective interventions. And then I think also it's an easy lift for schools. And so I always say that's the first one I'm saying, that if you've got, especially tier 2 level, check in, check out is great. It gives you targeted goals. It helps you track the data. It gives kids that relationship building piece, that reinforcement that they need in order to meet those goals. And it gives that, it's a social reinforcer, basically, as much as it is like I get a sticker at the end of the day, or I get to pick something out of the treasure box if I meet my goals. It's got the social reinforcer of like, we're in this together and I'm checking in on you. So that's why it has such a broad-based use, and it's got a lot of evidence behind it saying like it works. But I think for me, like there are other ones that we don't talk about, which is sometimes academically with kids, they just need scheduled breaks, especially if it becomes overwhelming. And we know that academics and behaviors, we can play chicken and egg with that all day long when it comes to students, like what happened first. And oftentimes it's because academic work can be overwhelming for a kid in some capacity, whether it's their ability that they're struggling to comprehend the content, to process that content, or they can comprehend it, but for some reason it's not making it out, right? We can't perform it. And so I love to recommend, just off the cuff, like if we're seeing that it's an academic struggle for a kid, to start with scheduled breaks. Like making sure that you're giving that particular child the time to just reset themselves, to take a breath. You're also teaching regulation skills for students in that time, which we need. How do I then use this scheduled break time to recenter, reground myself in a healthy way? And that usually lends itself to less disruptive behaviors if we give them those scheduled breaks. And depending on the kid's needs, sometimes they may just need that in the middle of the day, or sometimes they may need that, just 5 minutes per period or per block. So it depends on the kids, but that's another really like what some teachers call them like brain breaks, that they use them for their whole class. But this is about narrowing that in for a particular student and what their needs are, and making sure that that's set just for them. So those are two of my like tier 2 go-tos. It's usually going to be check in, check out, or some type of scheduled break intervention.
So, and you're exactly right on the check in, check out. Is it being a kind of a low lift for schools? It's an easy entryway, because like you said, we're limited on resources, but one resource we're not limited on is mentors in schools. We got plenty of folks who are quality mentors. So like, that's a good place to start. The scheduled breaks are awesome. And I've used those too. I mean, I even myself personally at work, I do some scheduled breaks, walk away from it for a minute. Like it works for kids too. The key pieces there that I think are good to keep in mind for folks that are new to this, or they're working on buying, or they're just getting going. You talked about basing everything on data and tracking that data, and then you use one keyword there where you said less disruptions. And when you're talking about buying, I think it's good that folks know that like any intervention is probably not going to completely eliminate a behavior, or it's not going to completely do something. The point is improvement and working towards a goal. So like a lot of times you can implement something, and if it doesn't totally work from like the classroom teacher standpoint, that well, they'll just say that doesn't work. This first time they have one disruption. Well, okay, that didn't work. It's important to keep in mind that you're talking about less and you're talking about improving, like it's growth.
Right. And what I love that you brought that up because, in working with teachers and leaders too, I always say like there's no magic wand for this. I wish there was. I wish there was like a magic wand and we could come in and go poof. All right, we're done. But I always, and to your point about we're not going to see change overnight, and we got to focus on progress over time, right? And I always bring that back to the adult perception. I go, tell me about your New Year's resolutions. How's that going for you? Have you changed behavior? How long did it take you to get your exercise weight goal? Did that happen overnight? Or did you have to stay with it, adjust, and monitor how that worked for you? And so for me, it's like the behavior didn't develop overnight. It's not going to change overnight. And if you can make that personal for teachers of like, tell me about something that you've tried to change and how hard that is for you as an adult, imagine what that's like for a kid. So let's focus on the wins, right? And using data to really say, okay, where are we making some progress or getting some traction? Let's do more of that.
I love that because if you're up front in the faculty meeting and you're telling them about these structures we're going to use, and if you use that example, what you're doing is you're creating empathy, which is what we want our kids to do too. Like, then it's just a valuable skill.
So I have a question because I was a teacher for 7 years, and so I always think about it like from the teacher aspect and like what would this look like in my room. And so when it comes to the breaks, the scheduled breaks, is it like, I would assume it's student specific. So are you letting the student decide what that break looks like, or how does that all work for the teachers to do in the classroom?
Yeah, I think what you have to consider in that is age of the student. So your developmental age. We're talking about independent ability, agency. Where are they in that? I would say some of the simplest ways to do that is creating break cards, especially if they're a little bit older. And I would say, when I say older, I mean like late elementary into secondary, like letting them start to recognize when they need one and then appropriately using a break card. And then the teacher is recognizing, okay, now I need to give you 5 minutes and let you do, and then what to choose in that moment, whether that's, going to get a drink of water and stepping out of the class and going for a walk, whether that's doing something at your desk, like, drawing or reading, or getting on your laptop and listening to music for just a second, whatever that is, they know. And when the timer's off, the teacher is looking back and saying, good job, you used your break. With younger students, that may be more as, we would expect. It's more of prompting from the teacher to do that. I'll tell teachers, like, this student, you're with them 8 hours plus a day, right? So you can start to see when they're getting like the antsiness. What are you noticing when that happens? Prompt the break, Or for some teachers, that may not work for them because they've got 500 other things they're trying to do. I better finish. My pacing's going to be off if I don't finish this lesson, by the end of this section, or we're going to be off. Or if I don't get this data, I can't figure out what my small groups need to look like. So sometimes it's nice to just have a timer. So just let a timer go off and know that's, I need to prompt that kid to take a break.
And there's some ways to be discreet about it too in a classroom setting, so everyone doesn't know that they have this break. One trick we had, I taught high school. We had this what we call the purple folder, and the purple folder, it just had like a blank roster in it. It didn't have anything necessary, but like if a student had a break that was needed, that would be, hey, can you take this folder over to the teacher, Mr. Brown, and that would be a movement break. He'd walk and take it there, and that time period would be the time they'd kind of resettle. And it was intentional because Mr. Brown was probably his his mentor. Yes, I'm sorry. How, however it worked out, but it was a folder that they didn't know what was in it. It just, hey, I'm going to take this way, and it worked out pretty well because you could do it without the whole class knowing they were doing it.
Mm-hmm. And I think we don't give students and youth enough credit to recognize when other kids need more support. It's always one of my favorite, and I won't get off, but one of my favorite, as a school psychologist, one of my favorite stories that illuminates that is I was coming in and out of a classroom doing some observations, trying to help a teacher with a student that was struggling with their behaviors in their classroom. And over time, I was coming in trying to help support the intervention and give the teacher feedback. And over time, what would happen is that when I walked through the hallways, that class, when they would see me, would be like, Blank is doing good today. They've done so much better. They know that some kids need more support. And I think that, when we get older, that it becomes about what's fair and what's equal and why does they get to do that and do that. But I think, especially in the elementary age, they want a kid to get the support they need, especially if a kid's struggling and disrupting the whole class. They're like, he needs more help or she needs more help. So we don't give kids enough credit, I think, for recognizing why there's differentiation in some of those supports.
One of my favorite things to ask on this podcast, because it's about school culture overall, and we talk about all these little topics within, is like, what are the signs of a good culture? And I think you just named a great one. If kids would advocate for other kids in rooms, that's awesome sign.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that also kind of normalizes that we at this school we help each other. That's that culture piece too. It's not just the teachers or students. It's when it gets in the water like that, it's like we help each other.
Yeah, that's good stuff. You're doing things right when those kind of things are happening.
Yes, absolutely.
So we've mentioned data a few times. How can schools use software like Live School to support MTSS efforts?
Yeah, I think we talked about the tiered system, right? Being tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So Live School really comes into play, I think, in tier 1. So if we want to place how that's used, it's a tier 1 tool. And it's used to help support and reinforce, the behaviors and expectations and those cultural things, those social emotional skills, academic skills that you want to see more of in your school. So really, it's a reinforcer of the skills and the expectations that you want to see in your school. I think it's wonderful for schools to use in the sense of we also talked about working in silos and isolation, needing data to make good decisions, and being able to use tools that help us not be as stretched thin on lifting that whole system. And I think Live School really does that as far as some people call it PBIS systems, however you term it, but really it's your rewarded acknowledgement system. Right. And so for me, it's easy to use. Everybody has access to it. You can see who's using it, who's not using it, who's engaged. You can see top behaviors, like what are we doing really well? What do we need more work on? And you're able to do that in a very quick and effective way. So it doesn't take a lot of time or resources to analyze that data. So to me, it does kind of both. It helps you teach and reinforce. And then it also gives you that data, that easy lift for you to make those decisions about what we need more of at tier 1 or why we're seeing more tier 2 and tier 3 needs.
So from a secondary school perspective, a lot of times if you're in this meeting and you're talking about plans for a student, the data that you have a lot of times is discipline referrals and their grades and their attendance. That's the things you look at. And that tells you part of the picture. It may not tell you exactly what's happening in those classes. That's where I think the value is at, because you can see for that level is you may not with referral, you need to see what all happens on a daily basis that leads to that. That tells you what you need to address. That tells you what intervention is going to work.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that, like, when I've been working with some schools recently about how they're using live school and implementing that, one of the things that I always want them to consider first is, like, how do we get fidelity of usage so that when you do go in to look at individual classes or individual teachers or even individual students, we can assuredly say that this is, like, being used with fidelity, like it's being used regularly, consistently, uniformly, right? And so for me, that's that first step that you have to do. But live school helps you do that in a very easy way so that you can then look at more individualized data to make those kind of decisions like you were just naming.
Cathy, this has been great. Thank you so much. This is a great explanation of MTSS. And if somebody's new to this is a great starter kit for them. This is a good place to start as far as a resource. If they wanted to reach out, ask you more questions, look up more of the work you're doing, where would they find you?
We have a website. It's www.sweetgrasscac.com. It stands for CAC, stands for Counseling and Consultation. I always like to plug that in there. That's why it's CAC. But sweetgrasscac.com. They can just contact us. We have a request a consultation, a request contact right on our website.
Yeah, and that'll be in the show notes. Hannah, anything before we go?
No, this was super helpful for me personally because MTSS and RTI were always like talked about interchangeably almost. And so I was like, okay, it's just what it is. But understanding kind of the differences was enlightening. So thank you, Cathy.
The Flywheel Effect, harnessing the power of momentum to create a school culture that celebrates change and drives itself.